little bit of technical info here before we get started. We're going to go back in time a little bit, back to about Christmas time when Art was preaching on Isaiah. Honestly, most of you guys know better than I do that the story or the series of stories in the Bible here at this point are arranged more by type than by time. So we have the major prophets, like the 66 chapter behemoth that is Isaiah, and then we have Isaiah and then Jeremiah, the other one, then his Lamentations. Then we have Ezra and Daniel, and then we get to the minor prophets, the prophets who have a little bit smaller books. And the first of those is Hosea. Hosea only has 14 chapters, but it's an incredibly deep story. And the first one I have up here is just a couple things on Hosea. There's a couple of quotes that I came upon when I was researching this. It's a very deep story. He was described as a great literary tactician, or how did I have that? I don't know. It's also a notoriously difficult book to study, or to analyze, and so we're going to slog through that here. But I'd like to actually start with a couple stories of my own. First, I used to do a lot of running, and back a few years ago when my son was quite a bit younger, he would ride his bike with me while I ran, and would go all over the place and have a good time. It was really good bonding exercise, and we'd talk and tell stories. And one of his favorite things, he'd always ask for trooper stories. And some of you know I work with a lot of state troopers, so I've collected a lot of anecdotes over the years. And one of them that was real on my mind that day, I can still remember exactly where I was on the Nampa Greenbelt as I told him this story. It was a hard one to hear, but to tell was even harder. So we'll see if I can do it now without getting too choked up. But one of our veterans now, at the time, he was told the story of years ago. He was on the road. It was his very first fatal crash, and a young man was unfortunately gotten into some things he shouldn't have been into. He got into drugs and too much alcohol, and made a lot of mistakes. And one night he was driving, and he was very, very slow, so the truck behind him decided to pass him, big truck, and he decided to make a left-hand turn in front of that truck with no warning, and that big truck rolled right over him, and he died. And he was still, when the trooper came on scene, he was lying there in the road, still clutching the beer bottle that had partly killed him. And as he was measuring the scene out and processing the scene as troopers do, a pickup truck came up behind his vehicle, and a big guy, rancher type, stepped out. Trooper said the guy looked like John Wayne himself coming out of this truck, which was an impressive thing because the trooper who's telling this story is probably 2 inches taller than me and just built like a brick. So it was kind of an impressive scene, and the gentleman walked up to the trooper, said, "Hey, can I say something to my son there?" And so the trooper said, yeah, of course. So the gentleman walked up to the blanket that was covering his now deceased son, knelt down, pulled back the blanket, and said, "Boy, I told you this was going to happen. I told you. And you didn't listen." It's kind of a nightmare scenario for parents. When you have a kid, you're trying so hard to get them to go the right way, and it doesn't always work out. Second story, hopefully not as depressing. Years ago, before I was attending this church, obviously this church wasn't even an apple in Mickey's eye at this point. And I was attending another Bible study, and I can't remember if we were talking about Hosea or not at this point, but there was a middle-aged woman who was talking about this kind of thing, about prostitution or former prostitutes, and she said, "I would never want someone like that for my son." And I asked her why, and she just kind of looked at me very oddly and then continued on with her point. And I took that to mean that she could deal with other kinds of sin in a prospective daughter-in-law, but not someone with that particular past. And like I said, it struck me as odd, but because a lot of sins can ruin things, especially marriages, right? But there is something about sexual sin. It's just my observations of history and in the world. It's something that's always been looked on as more more powerful, more hurtful, or worse in some way. And over time, like, societies have had to deal with that, societies and cultures, and we make different laws, and we deal with things in different ways, you know, around sex and sexual sin and marriage. And we personally have to deal with all that as well. So this is a historical thing as well as a very, very personal thing. And so with several thousand years of sexual politics kind of bearing down on us, we end up in Hosea. And the first, you know, Hosea, there's the typical introductory passage for a new prophet, telling where he's from and all that. And then they hit us with this. And the Lord first spoke through Hosea. The Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." Now, if any of you have seen the Truth Project, Del Tackett talks a passage in the Bible where they use that word and to describe the people of Israel, and he says, we don't really like that word. And we don't. Like adultery itself, it carries there's a lot of weight to that. There's a lot of emotion tied to this subject. And some people, or some translations, use the word harlotry or other things. Meaning is pretty much the same, but possibly they use that to kind of mitigate the impact of the things that we're going to talk about. And these are not problems we're going to solve today. Like, there's a lot of baggage with all this. Some of us have been in adulterous relationships, or maybe been the adulterous person in that relationship, or you've been a victim of kind of misguided sexual politics, or you've used those things to your advantage, and now you're a little bit guilty. I get it. There's a lot of baggage, like I said, that comes with this, and I want us to kind of acknowledge that. And I want to think about that a little bit in terms of how, like, as much as those things hurt us, how much must they hurt a perfect God when we do those things, when we sin like that against Him? But I also want to ask us to put that aside a little bit, because if we get too wrapped up in kind of a war of the sexes, or in how bitter we are about some of those things, then we'll miss the message here that I think God has in Hosea for us. And that's the message of faith-filled trust. Now, at first glance, Hosea doesn't seem like the kind of story that typifies trust. It is. And we'll get to that. Some of you may remember a few months ago, I think it was July, Art talked about faith-filled relationships. And he kept talking about, he repeated, "You can have faith in me, and here's why." And you'll see that with Hosea as well. You can trust in God. And hopefully, by the end of this, we'll have talked a little bit about why. But the people of Israel at this point are not trusting God. They're trusting in almost everything else. They've built up an army. I'll read here from chapter 10, verse 13, the second part of it. "You have trusted in your own way and in the multitude of your warriors." They've also amassed a great deal of wealth. And just the one that came to mind for me in Hosea was chapter 12, verse 8. Ephraim has said, but I'm rich. I found wealth for myself. In all my labors, they cannot find in me iniquity or sin. And they've also made treaties with the neighboring countries to protect themselves militarily instead of trusting God for their protection. And most importantly, they've given themselves to worshiping the false gods of their neighbors, sometimes at the exclusion of the one true God, and sometimes they would do it while treating him as just kind of one of many gods. And we can see some of the parallels with that in our lives as well, correct? Some people will kind of say those kinds of things as well. And at that point, the story of an adulterous spouse, right, begins to make sense from that perspective. And the one that I have, the passage that I have in Hosea that alludes to that is going to be chapter 8, verse 4. To both of those things, the first half, "They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold, they made idols for their own destruction." One verse kind of talks about both of those sins that the people of Israel have fallen into. And I want to discuss specifically about those things for a moment, because we're at a pivotal point in our discussion here, I think. Most, if not all, Bible stories are applicable to us as individuals, but also as a group, as a culture, or this church, or the church as a whole, or maybe the world at large. So I want to talk about that without getting too into, we're living in the end times, the end is nigh. I don't want to go that far, but we're living in a time and a culture where we have a lot of freedom, and we get to participate in our own political process in a way that most cultures historically at least, haven't. But like the ancient Israelites, many of us made politics our God, or at least made politics one God among many. Let's take the recent events as an example, and I don't want to get too into this, but I think it's a good example. About a week ago, we had several people, so far as we can tell, mostly conservatives, broke into the U.S. Capitol and stole things, broke stuff, killed at least one police officer. And unsurprisingly, many of those, even Christians, who had been silent about a lot of things that have been happening the last couple of months, are suddenly up in arms about this Capitol incident. And on the other hand, you have some people who are strangely quiet in the last week, but have been railing and railing and railing over some of the things that mostly liberals have been doing in other parts of the country, the burning and the rioting and the looting and all that. Not a lot has changed, I feel like, in 2,500 years, and maybe you can kind of tell me afterwards if you think I'm wrong. But there are other instances of that, even if that one's not correct. I bring this up for two reasons. One, because we're not that much different than the ancient Israelites, and we have to be very, very careful to remain very, very pure in our worship, and to make sure that God is the only God of our life. And I admit, it's I'm not saying this to you as someone who has done it perfectly. Those of you who know me know well that I'm not. But we have to be very, very careful. But to get back to Israel, things were going well for Israel in the sense of they were politically, they had a lot of clout, they were wealthy, they had a lot of things going for them, but all this came at a cost. It's interesting to note that the first three chapters of Hosea are about his relationship with his wife, and then the fourth begins the poetic language that we're used to seeing with prophets. And it starts with an indictment. Chapter 4, verse 1, the second part, all the way through verse 2. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bonds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. So let's take those things in order. For the first half, I'd like us to go back to Genesis 18. I'm not going to pull it up because this is kind of a long passage, and I don't know if we'd be able to read it on here or not. But to sum up, Abraham now has a nephew, Lot, who's living in the city of Sodom, which was notorious for sinful behavior. And Abraham has this experience with three messengers of God, and then those messengers leave, and he's left to kind of speak with God, and he's very, very cautious because he doesn't want to treat this as he's talking to God himself, and he doesn't want to treat this as a flippantly or as a common thing. But he says, "Oh God, be patient with me. I just want to ask, if there are 50 people left in this city, will you wipe out the righteous with the unrighteous, if the city needs to be wiped out?" And God says, no, for the sake of the 50, I will spare that city. And he says, Abraham says, well, be patient with me. I just want to ask you another question. If 5 of those people leave, then will you spare the city for the 45? And God says, yes, for the sake of the 45, I will spare them. And Abraham keeps this up for a time, again, each time asking God to be patient with him. And he whittles it down to 10. Now, I suspect when he got to 10, he had felt like maybe he was pushing his luck, pestering God with all these questions. I don't know. But I suspect that if there were 10 righteous people and one of them went on vacation to Tyre or Gomorrah, that God wasn't going to say, that 10th person's gone. I suspect that's not how it works. So think about that previous passage, the Hosea passage there in chapter 4, in that context. When he says there's no love, no steadfast love, no faithfulness, no knowledge of God in the land, I think he means there's no faithfulness, no love, none of those things. There's not one person left. Jeremiah would say something similar in his book, in Jeremiah 5:1, run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, look and take note. Search her squares to see if you can find a man, one who does justice and seeks truth, that I may pardon her. Her meaning the city of Jerusalem. There's no one left. Now to address the second half of our, going back to our Hosea page there, or clip there, people at that time, one of the local customs was that they would hire local prostitutes religious prostitutes in order to gain favor of the local gods. It was something like to engage in an act of fertility with this temple prostitute or religious prostitute would then bring fertility on the land or crops. So in doing so, the people were adulterous not only to each other, but they were adulterous to God. And for another example, some people, at least several kings, and not to mention the lay people, burned or otherwise sacrificed their own children to the gods of Canaan or Sepharvaim, etc. One particularly ugly example was the god of Moloch. Moloch was he had the body of a man, but he had a bull head. And the statues are typically depicted like here. You have the arms reaching out like this, and into these arms you would put a child, and there was a fire lit, usually in the chest or belly area, and the own parents would put their children in the arms, which were hot to the touch a lot of times because of this fire, and these children would roll down the arms, screaming to a horrible death. This was a people that were thoroughly debauched, and all that to say that the first thing about faith-filled trust is you can trust God's judgment. If he sends it, you can trust that it's deserved. Now, I had some sheets to print out where you could do all this, but then, of course, I forgot them, so sorry about that. But we may also trust that God is merciful and just, and patient and willing to give every last chance. So in a last-ditch effort to help people save them from themselves, he sends a prophet who, more than anyone else before this, is a symbol of the living God. Hosea lays his entire life down, his time, his pride, even his children. As we talked about earlier, Hosea follows God's command to take a wife who will be adulterous to him. They have 3 children, and their very names are prophetic of judgment. The first is a son, and I'll go to chapter 1, verse 4. Call his name Jezreel, for in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I'll put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Now, it should also be noted that in Hebrew, Jezreel is very similar in pronunciation to Israel. Now, I'm not going to pronounce it because I'll butcher it, but it's most likely a deliberate play on words. Your very name is going to be synonymous with being scattered. The word means to sow or to scatter, like seed that you fling out, that a farmer would fling out into a field, or maybe to feed some chickens, who knows. His second child is a daughter named Lo Ruhama, which means no mercy, and Lo Ami, not my people. Hosea's wife repeatedly leaves him to play the prostitute, and at one point she gets herself so deep into trouble or debt, we don't know which, that she's to be sold as a slave. And Hosea, or Hosea, whose very name means God save, kind of like God save with an exclamation mark, or bring salvation, has to go save her. He has to redeem her. He has to buy her back, literally buy her back. Now what follows in the next 11 chapters is difficult to describe. In waves that ebb and flow, God indicts his lay people, leaders, and priests as being completely unfaithful. There's no segment of society that's remained true, even the priests. He pleads with them to return to him, warns them sometimes angrily of their impending doom, and he mourns for the choices that they're making. And certain psychologists have come up with a number of stages of grief. Some say 5 stages, some say 7. I think I have slides here. Here's one with 5 stages of grief. And it's usually, denial at first, like, no, I don't have a problem, I can't believe this is true. And then after that, there's, some, anger in this case or whatever. There's one with 5 and one with 7, and I'll put them up here, but the theory is that you're supposed to move from one kind to the other. That's not usually the way it works in my experience. And I've talked to other psychologists who say, no, that's not really true. You don't go cleanly from one to the other, but rather you kind of bounce around when you're grieving something big, like sometimes from a day-to-day basis, or sometimes even to a minute-to-minute basis. You'll be angry one day and depressed the next. You'll be in denial in 1 minute. You'll go back to testing or bargaining. And I certainly don't want to anthropomorphize God or bring him down to our level in any way, but if you read Hosea, there's something very touching and perhaps comforting in the similarity in the way in which God moves himself through the stages of grief. For example, at the end of chapter 5, he says, "For I will be like a lion to Ephraim. Like a young lion, I will tear into the house of Judah. Even I, will tear and go away. I will carry off, and no one shall rescue. I will return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face, and in their distress earnestly seek me." And then right after that, he promptly begins chapter 6 with this: "Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going out, is as sure as the dawn. He will come to us as showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. What shall I do with you, Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. Therefore I have hewn them by my prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as the light." You can see him kind of God himself going through kind of anger, and then kind of wanting to kind of bring people back in, like, come, return. And then, then there's anger, and then there's, what am I going to do with you? This kind of despair. And I don't want to rehash Riker's sermon from last week, but his was about Israel's grief mostly, our grief, right? Jeremiah's grief. And I do want to point out that you can trust, and I think these passages prove, you can trust that before we grieve, God has grieved for us. And he does so because he's brokenhearted that we have left a loving husband to play the harlot and gotten ourselves into a lot of trouble, maybe even slavery. And remember how Jesus said in Matthew, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who stoned the prophets," and all that, "how I wanted to take you under my wing. The city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." Israel is about to come under assault from the Assyrians. Again, at this point, we're back in Isaiah's time. The northern kingdom has not fallen, and since that came afterwards, the southern kingdom hasn't fallen either. They're on the verge. They can still be saved. But rather, this time, instead of having a Hezekiah to pray to God for salvation, this time they're going to turn to their idols, and they're going to fall. And a heart-sick God is about to look down and say, "Boy, I told you this was going to happen. I told you." And he didn't listen. Now, it would have been shocking to Israel at this time, with their political and financial power, to hear a prophet that was telling them the destruction was close, and it would have been even more shocking when that destruction was at hand. But you may trust that God's providence is worth more than all of those things. You may trust that God's prophecies are true, whether you believe them or not. For every other culture I know where this has happened, that's the end of the story. There is no coming back from being scattered into the wind. Curiously, though, in Hosea, there are a number of passages that are woven through the story. In Hosea, there's not like ever one theme. They're just dotted all over. And it's one of the things that makes it hard to analyze, but that's partly maybe what God was intending, to make sure that they knew, even though I'm going to scatter you, I'm going to bring you back. And that's what we see. There are a number of touching passages here. I'll use one as an example. After he gets talking about the names of the children, "No mercy" and "Not my people," and all that, comes this, chapter 1, verse 10, "Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are my people," or "you are not my people," "it shall be said to them, children of the living God. And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered up together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head. And they shall go up for the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel." Now, if they've been scattered, how are their children going to be like the sand of the sea? And if they've been scattered, how are they going to not only that, come together and now have not two kings but one? Because remember, the kingdom was split at this time. How are they going to do that? Here's another one. In chapter 2, "And in that day I will answer, declares the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. And the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will sow for herself, I will sow for myself in this land, and I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God. Those passages are almost utopian, and it's by design. They're meant to be. When the Israelites were sitting in Hosea's time, like I said, it would have been a shock to know that judgment was coming. They had wealth, power, and political allies. They should have known that his word was to have been trusted. They should have known that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Despite all that they had, the northern kingdom fell, and it will be followed soon after by the southern kingdom. But just as unlikely was that a scattered nation would be brought back, and just as unlikely, or just as trustworthy rather, is God's prophecy to have them return. Neither of those things would have been possible but for God. You may trust that God's prophecies, again, are true whether we believe them or not. And so I want to wrap up with this. In Ezra and Nehemiah's time, the Israelites were allowed to come back to their homeland, and we may study that depending on what Jim decides to do here. But remember Hosea and Hosea, his name means God save or bring salvation. So hundreds of years later, in the northern part of the valley of Jezreel is a town called Nazareth. And a young man will grow up in this town called Nazareth named Yeshua, or we call Jesus, whose name is God is salvation. The answer to God save is God is salvation. And much has been made of that, but he's going to grow up, save us, redeem us, and buy us back, and that would be enough again. But I think even further than that, somewhere in our future there's going to be a battle between God's army and the devil's army, and there's some debate on this, but in the valley of what's called Megiddo, which is another name for the valley of Jezreel. And after that battle, I'm not going to get too into the end times things, but after that battle, there's going to be like 1,000 years of peace. There's going to be all sorts of, it's after this final battle, the children were going to live in the kind of utopia that Hosea is describing here. The things that Hosea describes, it's the kind of thing that reminisces of the lion and the lamb lying down together and that kind of thing. So you can trust, and I would encourage us today to trust that in all of our suffering, God is there, and he will not let us suffer forever. You can trust, in fact, that there are great things coming. And I'll close with that. Thank you. Lord, we thank you that you are a God who provides, and even when we're unfaithful with what you've provided us, we thank you that you are grieving for us. We thank you that you sent your Son to weep over our sins, but that he would dry his tears and do his work to save us and love us. And we thank you for your hand being in all these things. We thank you for being the great and wonderful God you are. And we ask you to give us strength, Lord, to stay faithful and true and to serve your purpose. In Jesus' name, amen.